Okay,
That's smart.
good afternoon on this, not record-setting heat. We're cool compared to the Northwest. I can't believe how it could be 110 in Seattle with little air conditioning. But thank you all for coming in this very uncomfortable weather. We have representatives of different boards and commissions here. We have a representative of the Board of Education. We have a good contingent from NPU board. We have members of the Pension and Personnel Board, and we have members of the council. Now, people wonder, we had to have it at 4 because there's meetings going on at 6 o'clock tonight. So we were trying to squeeze this in before we get the start of July, because if we go ahead with this project and this bond, we need to have it done in August, because then it would go to the ballot in November, and because it goes on the ballot in November, it has to be approved by the Secretary of State. So that's why it really contracts the amount of time that we have to prepare for it, and that's why we're starting late June. And I'll get to that a little later when I talk about the timing of this bond issue. Well, you know, although pension obligation bonds, which is what we're talking about today, POBs, only seem to interest investors, the proposal really, I think, can be a game changer for the way the city manages its long-term pension obligations. And I truly believe it can be a game changer. So we've brought together a number of staff plus financial experts that help manage our pension system and manage the investments to our pension system. So we have our, and I'll introduce them now. We have myself as city manager, Mike Gualtieri, who's the treasurer. Josh Pothier is the controller. Then we have John Strathstrom. He's our bond counsel, because this is a bond issue. He just raised his hand. Mark Shigoski. Mark is managing director of wealth management for UBS. They do management of our pension system. Then we got Matthew Spernduel. He's a financial advisor for Phoenix Advisors. And then finally, last but not least, Becky Silman. She's the city's consulting actuary from Milliman Inc. And Becky and I go back quite a few years. In other cities and towns that I've managed, Becky has been there. So I know Becky for a long time and really trust a lot of what she says. I really, when Becky says something, it's like that old-fashioned, and E.F. Hutton, they listen and whatever. I'm dating myself with that one. So what's a pension obligation bond, the POB? We're going to try to answer that question today. We're going to be doing a tag team situation. I'm going to introduce and then step out of the way until the end. Why should Norwich issue POBs or pension obligation bonds? How would we manage the risk? Because there is, whenever you're investing, there's no guarantee of an investment year to year, so you have to manage that and make sure that you have enough of proceeds from investments to carry you forward, and that's important. And then finally, what is the POB approval process? And we'll be talking about that towards the end. So this is an extraordinary interest rate environment we're in now. This is really one of the prime reasons why we can consider this. We think we can borrow taxable bonds at 3%. And we're very optimistic that we can invest the proceeds at 6.25 on an average, 6.25%. And right now, we have in our actuary assumption 7.25. So we're reducing this for this bond issue to be ultra conservative. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike, our treasurer, who will talk about some of these definitions. Mike?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for coming. Today you're going to hear from several different speakers, and I hope to offer a little different perspective as I am an elected official, okay, which means I'm a resident and I'm also a taxpayer. A significant part of my job is spent investing taxpayer receipts with a constant eye on interest rates. And I'm looking for the best possible return for the taxpayer. A greater return obviously means lower taxes. As part of today's discussion, we're going to talk about why lower interest rates help when you owe a debt. A lower interest rate obviously means a lower interest payment. Please make no mistake, the taxpayers or the city currently owe our pensioners $145 million. And the payment for this liability is currently structured like a long-term variable rate loan where the annual payment changes. Looking back just before I was elected in 2015, our annual pension obligation was about $6 million. Today, it's $13 million. As a result of this increase, many programs, services, and people have been cut from the city budget. To remedy this problem, we seek to take advantage of a unique interest rate opportunity and replace this variable rate scenario with a fixed rate scenario. Our intent is simple. We would like to exchange one liability for another lower cost liability. This will give our elected officials the ability to enter into budget creation with certainty of a fixed or level principal and interest payment while achieving long-term savings. Personally, in my 63 years of existence, 32 years of which was in the banking industry, I have never seen interest rates this low. Okay, I don't know if we will ever see them this low again, or perhaps in my lifetime. So why issue $145 million of pension obligations now? Because this is a unique interest rate environment. The taxpayer or city stands to save $40 million and maybe more, but the clock is ticking. Thank you.
Just to go over the basics of pension obligation bonds, a pension obligation bond essentially replaces one liability with another liability. You take the unfunded pension liability that the city has and issue bonds to deposit into the pension trust. So we issue bonds similar to the way that we issue bonds for roads or schools or fire apparatus, and pay them over a number of years. The rate that we pay on these bonds is slightly higher because of IRS rules that require that they be sold on a taxable basis. Set 0.75 to 1% higher typically over the life of the bonds. So the proceeds of the bonds are deposited right into the pension trust and invested alongside the rest of the funds in the pension trust in a diversified portfolio. So the city has taken a number of steps to decrease to manage the pension liability. One of the main ways that we've done that is through bargaining unit negotiations. We have increased the years of service required for new public safety employees from 20 to 25 years for retirement, eliminated free survivorship benefits for new employees. We have increased contributions for employees, that the requirement of them paying into the pension fund, and put caps on overtime for public safety employees. While doing that, we have began using more conservative actuarial assumptions, and Becky Seelman will go into the impact of those in later slides. And we've changed our funding policy to deal with the increases in liabilities created by using more conservative actuarial assumptions.
So I'm the technical expert here. Feel free, if you have questions about the technical content, to speak up. I'm here to make sure you understand what you're facing. And the first technical thing is, Josh mentioned that one of the significant things that's been happening over the past bunch of years is the city has been lowering the interest rate assumption that's used to measure how well funded the pension plan is, that's used to put a dollar value on the pension plan liability. And the calculation of the liability is very sensitive to changes in the interest rate assumption. Over the past 15 years, the interest rate assumption has been reduced from 8.25 to 7.25. That 100-point reduction increases liability about 10%. And 7.25 is still too high when we look at the expected future returns on the pension plan investment based on current market conditions and current expectations about future investment returns. So the interest rate is what we expect the pension investments to earn long term as we look today. And today, in the very low interest rate environment, you can get a car loan for ridiculously low interest rates. You can get a mortgage for ridiculously low interest rates. That's been great for the pension investments while interest rates have been falling, because they make a lot of the pension investments more valuable. But they've gone just about as far as they can down. And when they rise going forward, that will hurt the returns on some of the pension investments. So this is a picture. I know that the text is too small to see from in the back of the room, but I am the author of Milliman's Public Pension Funding Study. We do an annual study of the 100 largest US public pension plans, and we take a look each year at what current expert thinking is about future investment returns. Here's where we were in 2001, and the median was 8.25. So was your interest rate assumption in 2001, give or take. And now here in 2020, we're at 5.5 for the same hypothetical portfolio. This isn't your portfolio. This is just a typical public pension investment portfolio. But over this 20-year period, the expert thinking about future returns has plummeted from 8.25 to 5.5 for this portfolio. For your portfolio, we think 6.25 is a conservative estimate of future returns. But each reduction in the interest rate increases the liability by about 10%. So a more realistic future-looking interest rate assumption means a bigger liability and therefore a more underfunded pension plan. So we're here today partly because interest rates have fallen, and that's made your pension plan less well-funded than it used to be. And partly we're here today because those same interest rates, the bond interest rates, the rates at which you can go out and borrow money, are at historic lows, which makes it very attractive to borrow money to fund the pension plan. Here's a history of your unfunded pension liability for the City of Norwich pension plan. Back in 2004, the unfunded pension liability was 9.3 million. As of our most recent valuation in July 2019, it was 122 million. There are a lot of things that happened during this time period. For instance, the financial crisis. The investments lost a lot of money during the market meltdown. It got gradually translated into increases in the unfunded accrued liability over a 5-year period. That's what's going on here. But then you can see that it's kept going up, and that's reductions in the interest rate assumption. It's modifying our assumption about life expectancies to reflect that people are living longer. And during this time period, there have been some good investment years and some bad investment years, but overwhelmingly, the big headwind that the pension plan has faced is that the interest rate assumption has been decreased in 2013, 2017, 2019, and it still needs to go down further. This 122 million figure is based on a 7.25% interest rate assumption. And when we project forward to 2021 and have our best guess about the unfunded liability as of tomorrow, the end of the fiscal year, using a 6.25% interest rate assumption, we measure an unfunded liability of $144 million. So let's talk about how that translates into the city's contributions to the pension plan. That's what you hired me to do every other year. I come and give a report to the pension committee about how much the city should contribute to make sure that there's enough money to pay the benefits that have been promised to the city's employees. And that contribution consists of two pieces, which I've shown here on the chart. The blue on the bottom is called the normal cost. And it's the cost of the benefits that are being earned each year by the city's employees. So an employee, Josh works another year, he earns another year of benefits. The value of that benefit that Josh has earned and all of your other employees, maybe you're not in this plan, but yeah, all of the employees, that's the normal cost. So you contribute each year the cost of the benefits that were earned that year. Employees also contribute to the pension plan. So there's a sharing between employees and the city of the cost of the benefits being earned each year. But that's the small blue part, and the much bigger and growing green part.
Just to avoid my confusion, is that the actual total liability we're talking about versus actual money spent, or?
No, so normal cost is the value of benefits that were earned that year by employees working for the city today. Okay. So it's not benefits that are being paid to retirees, it's the benefits that are being earned each year.
Okay.
So
basically the liabilities for that year.
For that year, exactly,
Okay,
exactly. So it's not.
Sorry to interrupt.
It's not benefits that were earned in the past. Mm-hmm. That's the accrued liability. That's what's short. You're short by $144 million. And this green payment here, this green part of the contribution, is an amount to gradually pay off that shortfall. Mm-hmm. So if you think of, you've promised more in benefits than you have money to pay for them. And that shortfall, that debt, is $144 million. If you do nothing, if you don't borrow money through a pension obligation bond, you have a $144 million debt. It'll have to be paid off over time. Those people earn those benefits. You don't have the money to pay those benefits. And so this green part of the contribution is the amount that will gradually pay that off over a period of time. And look at what it's done. You know, it's monstrously bigger now relative to the normal cost because the unfunded liability has mushroomed so much over the past 15 years. This gives your finance people high blood pressure, gray hair, or no hair, and wrinkles. It's large, it's growing rapidly, It's volatile. If the market goes up or down, the assets go up and down, this amount goes up and down. So this is not a comfortable place to be in. I will tell you that Norwich is not alone, that virtually every pension plan sponsored by cities and towns in Connecticut across the country looks like this. Matt, I think I turned it over to you.
Thanks, Becky. So we've had a nice overview of sort of where we are with what pension bonds are, the actuarial assumptions, and sort of how the city is where they are at this point, and what some of the numbers are. And we've talked a little bit about, you know, the interest rates from the perspective of the borrowing side, and then we're going to talk more about the investment of those proceeds after my slide. And really, I'm on the borrowing side, so as the city borrows money to build schools or roads, I work with the city in that regard. So I'm on the borrowing side, which John mentioned. For a pension bond, we'd be looking at taxable bonds, potentially right around 3%. And the reason why we're at 3% is really driven by this chart behind me. And you can see from left to right, starting at 91, coming up to present day, that rates have just been on a downward slope. If this curve or this trend line had gone up or stayed flat, we wouldn't be here having this discussion because the numbers just wouldn't work. So we're looking at a potential for 3% borrowing, which is why, based on the 10-year Treasury at around a 150, which pre-pandemic would have been the lowest Treasury rate in history. So the pandemic happened and things got a little crazy for a while there. And rates went under 1%, they went to close to zero. We were worried about negative rates. But the bottom line is, you know, your mortgage rates are low, your car loans rates are low because of what's happening in the taxable market. And this is what provides a potential opportunity to do something and say, we're going to have a 3% spread on borrowing at 3% potentially and investing at over 6%. 5, 6 years ago, if you're trying to borrow at 5, 6, 7% and your returns are 7.5%, it's just too tight and the margins aren't there, so you don't have the potential for those savings, and you don't even have this conversation in this meeting. So it's a very unique opportunity, and it's pretty obvious to see from the chart why that's happened, again, with rates as low as they are, and to potentially try to capitalize on that. So that's really the borrowing side in a nutshell. I'm going to hand it off to Mark Shagoski, who's going to talk more about the investment.
Thank you. We're representing the investment of funds. So when the pension obligation bond goes through, the proceeds will be put into the pool of assets that's being managed by us. We've had the privilege for a little over a decade now of working with the pension board, the citizens of Norwich, the council, and the city's administration also. Behind me is a chart showing the returns over the past 11 years. But I should point out these are calendar year, not fiscal year returns. Returns for 2021 are to the end of May, so we're going to not use those numbers as we go through them. What we're doing is managing the expectations of the returns that previously was mentioned of 6 to 6.5%. So we have a spread of we're borrowing at 3% to 6.5%. What this chart shows and what we should manage expectations to is the market's going to have volatility. The last 10 years, coming out to 2021, has had a lot of volatility we've kind of forgotten. In 2011, on the left side of the chart, we were at 0.23%. You may have forgotten the reason the market returned that was there was something called Brexit, where Britain coming out of the European Union crushed the market towards the end of the year, so we ended up with a return less than 1%. Then we had a number of good years, and then in 2015, we had an energy crisis. You may not remember that, but a lot of energy companies started blowing up. There were problems in the debt markets. The market turned down. And then we had some other good years that were 6.6%, 15%. And you may have forgotten in 2018 it was a down market because there were, again, financial crisis in what's called a repurchase market. And that took the market down, so we managed risk. A lot of portfolios were down double digits. We were down single digits. Then we had 2019, which was a very good year. 2020, if I was standing here in 2020, you would have thought the year was going to be down, finish the year up, and this year is good. So while it's no projection, we'll show in a couple of slides that we think we're capable of managing the money above the 6 to 6.5%. What I should point out, since we've been doing this, is the actual assumption was around 7 to 7.75%. If you average out the returns during out 2021, we're over 7.5 to 100% of the returns. So we've been meeting the actual assumption since we've been working with the city.
Okay, so now let's look into the future. There's a lot going on in this slide. Let me walk you through it. Here we are today in 2021, fiscal 21, absent a pension obligation bond, the city's contribution consists of two pieces. Same two pieces I showed you before looking backwards, normal cost in blue, and then that large payment to pay off the unfunded liability in green. If you issue the pension obligation bonds, your finance director has come up with a very important protective device to give you some budget stability. It's called a pension reserve fund. Next year in fiscal 22, when all of those pension obligation bond proceeds would get put into the pension trust, that contribution that you would otherwise make to the pension plan will get put into a reserve fund instead. So you've already budgeted those funds. They're in your fiscal 22 budget already. You'd put those monies into the reserve fund instead. You'd issue the pension obligation bonds and then put those into the pension trust. And then going forward, you'd still have normal cost in blue. It's somewhat higher because we're going to reduce the interest rate assumption to 6.25. So a lower interest rate means higher measures of liability, but a more conservative one. And then instead of paying off the unfunded liability over time, you'd be paying debt service. You'd be paying back the bonds. But the debt service payments are fixed. They won't change at all from one year to the next. So you have that certainty of what the debt payments will be as opposed to the uncertainty of what will happen to the unfunded accrued liability.
Sorry to bother you again. So
Sure.
it'd just be a flat number going out 30 years?
25
20
years.
years. 25 years.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And the blue line up top is what would have happened to the pension contribution if you did not issue the pension obligation bonds. So if you just continued on as normal. This is a completely artificial look at the future, though, that assumes the investments will earn 6.25% year in and year out. And if there's one thing I know standing here today, it's that that's not what's going to happen. If it did, if you somehow miraculously could have investments that always earn exactly 6.25, over time you'd have borrowed at 3 and invested at 6.25. The savings would gradually emerge. This area here between the green, the blue, and the bars, those are the savings. Over the 25-year period of the bond, assuming that you could issue bonds at 3%, which we think is a conservative number, a high number, you'd save $43 million. Now, the tricky thing is that we know this won't happen. We know the investments will not earn 6.25 each year. You'll have some good years and some bad years going forward, just like Mark showed you the pension plan has had in the past. It's inevitable. You will have more assets invested and subject to market risk. So the real reason the city hired me was not to paint this picture for you, but to do some really robust analysis to be able to help you get your arms around just what it means for you to be taking on more market risk because you'd have more money in the pension plan. So I will in just a minute show you some of the details of our analysis and help you understand what those risks are. But right now, Josh is going to tell you a little bit more about the risks in general that a pension obligation bond will subject the city to and the steps that we've helped craft to protect the city.
So if you were to do a Google search for pension obligation bonds, you will find some that didn't work out so well. And I would say that most of them share 1, 2, 3, maybe all of the potential problems to the left side of the screen. One thing that many of them didn't have is the interest rate environment that we have right now. They may not have done the sort of analysis that we hired Becky and her firm to do. The state of Connecticut requires a review process, which they ask for a substantial amount of information, follow-up questions, and to vet it further. Some of previous pension obligation bonds have taken all the proceeds and invested them immediately, all at once, into their pension funds, which, you know, sometimes it'll work out, but sometimes if you do that right before a market downturn, you'll lose, you could lose 20% of your, the value of the bonds right away. And as Becky mentioned before, we've worked out a pension reserve fund and an adjustment to our funding policy, which should provide even further stability to future budgets. This is all crafted so that the city of Norwich has the best chance at the lowest possible cost of paying for these benefits that we've bargained with our employees over the next 25, 30 years. So, Becky will go over some of the analysis involved in this process.
So I said a minute ago, we don't know what the investment returns will be for the next 25 years. I mean, if you know what
Yeah,
the market...
I'd have a lot more money, you know? I'd be doing a lot better than I am.
We wouldn't be here, right. So we don't know. But we do know a lot about the potential volatility of returns. We know for the different things that the pension plan is invested in about how much they will likely earn from one year to the next, but also how much riskiness, how much volatility there is, how good might be, how bad might be. And we took that information and ran it through a mathematical model to build 10,000 possible futures. I don't think any one of those 10,000 potential futures is necessarily any more likely to happen than 6 1/4 every year. But we can look at 10,000 possible futures and start analyzing what's likely, what looks really great, what looks really bad, and start getting our arms around the likely size of numbers. And we looked at a ton of different metrics. I've just pulled out 2 for you to look at today. And let me walk you through first. On the left-hand side, the net present value of the city's cost. So that's in today's dollars, what the city would be paying for its retirement program with a pension obligation bond and without a pension obligation bond. And let me help you read this. We took 10,000 scenarios, fast computers, doing lots of number crunching, and we sorted out the results from top to bottom. So we're talking about cost. A really good number is a low number. So the really good results are down here. The 5th percentile means that these are the best 5% of those 10,000 are this number or even lower. This is 197 million. And at the other end of the spectrum, the worst possible 5% are 653 million or higher. Now, these aren't very likely at either end of the spectrum. They're the 2 tails of the distribution. Not very likely great futures, and also not very likely really awful futures. Most likely is something somewhat in between, somewhere in this neighborhood. And the median here in black, median means average, means the next the 25 years are just as likely to be higher or lower than this number. So this is kind of the expected value. And without a POB, it's $435.5 million. Now that is all of your retirement program plus your other post-employment benefits that you provide, your retiree medical benefits, with no POB. With the POB, however, it drops down to $392.5 million, and that's a gap of $43 million. So on average, the city will come out ahead. But it's important to look at the extremes. What if the next 25 years are great? The cost is higher with the POB than without. If you have a great next 25 years, pension plan is going to be fully funded without having had to borrow. You'll have an overfunded pension plan, and you'll still have to pay debt service on the bonds. So a really great 25 years of investment returns, a pension obligation bond will actually cost the city a little bit more money than not having a pension obligation bond. And at the top end, it's a little bit higher as well. You have more money that you're investing in the market. If you have a really lousy 25 years, you'll end up with an underfunded pension plan. You've still got to pay the debt service. You'd be funding an underfunded pension plan. So at either extreme, a pension obligation bond will cost the city more. But those are the extremes. In the middle, in the likely future, the city will save, on average, $43 million over the lifetime of these bonds. Over here, we have a second metric that we tracked, which is how likely, what is the funded status of the plan likely to look like at the end of the bond repayment period, actually 30 years from now. Without a pension obligation bond, 25 years from now, the plan should be fully funded. It's likely to be fully funded. The city will be making contributions all along, and the plan will be headed towards fully funded. It might even get overfunded. Now, here we're talking about funded ratio. A high number is good. So these outcomes are the good numbers. These numbers down here are the bad results. With the pension obligation bond, you'll probably be about the same fully funded place at the end of the period, but there is a chance, not a very big one, but a chance that the pension plan might in fact get fairly significantly overfunded. Either way, in the dire, we hope we don't live through those next 25 years scenarios, the plan is likely to hover around 75% funded 25 years from now. So there'll be investment losses, and the city will be contributing, and you just won't get yourself out of the mud. Questions?
Regarding, and I think my primary concern is risk. So, as you could imagine. And I got a million things written down here already, but is there a number for investment return that would essentially be a break-even point?
We
Percentage-wise?
didn't analyze that, but on an expected savings point of view, you're generating expected savings if you can borrow at 3 and invest at 6 1/4. So if you're borrowing at the same rate that you're investing, you haven't changed your savings at all, you've just added more risk.
I'm just thinking, you know, if we achieve less of a return, you know, on where are we at that, you know, we got to consider that we're actually, you know, losing money in this deal.
Right.
That's all.
In about 80% of the scenarios, when we look at these, the break-even point, if you will, is that in about 80% of the scenarios, the city is better off with the POB than without. So the risk you're balancing is likely
80-20.
You'll save money, but you might not.
Don't you love the mathematical models? They do so good in presidential elections, too.
That isn't actuaries.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I think, a question? Go ahead.
Just wondering here, I know in the for-profit world, the COVID relief legislation extended the amortization period for benefit plans, I think it's 15 years or 7. I'm not sure if that has been extended to non-profits.
No, funding corporate pension plans follows an entirely different set of rules. The liability is measured differently, assets are measured differently, the way in which the contribution is calculated is different. Public plans follow actuarially sound rules for funding. Corporate pension plans do not. So corporate pension plans, whole different animal, not actuarially sound funding methods. Okay, I think, John, you're up next.
Thanks, Becky. I'm John Staffstrom. Some of you know my partner, Mike Adriana, from the firm Coleman & Cumley. He does a lot of your general capital bonding. You've seen him before. Our firm it's been through a lot of pension bonds for other clients. We've done pension obligation bonds in Stratford and Naugatuck and West Haven and in Bridgeport. Other cities have also done pension obligation bonds. Waterbury has done them, Hampton has done them, and most recently, West Hartford sold a very successful deal yesterday. Pension obligation bonds are issued under specific state legislation. The state legislature about 20 years ago wanted to make sure that pension obligation bonds weren't a Wild West in Connecticut, as they have been in other places. So we issue pension obligation bonds based on a strict state review process. The statute requires the city notify Office of Policy Management and the State Treasurer's Office about the issuance of the pension obligation bonds, and then they review and provide written comments on the information that's provided and recommendations. The theory on the legislation is that rather than just having the city review this and your experts review this, the experts at the state also review this. So the experts at OPM review this, and obviously the experts at the State Treasurer's Office, who do both the state's investing and the state's bonding, look at this and make recommendations. These recommendations are very important to the rating agencies. We, as your team, would spend a lot of time making sure we responded to the comments from the Office of Policy Management and the State Treasurer. The whole process is designed to make sure that the transaction is structured as beneficially as possible to the city. So in that regard, requirements are a current actuarial evaluation. The state wants to know that the problem is really what the problem is. An explanation of the strategic investment plan, including the asset allocation. We've had some discussion of that already. The state wants to make sure that you're not investing all of the proceeds on day one and have the market tank on day two, which is why you spread the new assets into the plan over time. State also wants to make sure you're not taking a flyer and investing 80% of your stock in Apple because you think it's going up, and then if Apple go down, so they look at the asset allocation that you adopt. 3-year financial plan. They want to know how the pension obligation bonds are going to affect the city on a financial basis, both in the level of contributions you would otherwise have to make for the pension, as also what the debt service involved. Comparison of the effects of funding the pension liability with the pension obligation bonds as opposed to maintaining the current structure. The state is going to help to structure the bonds and is going to look at the same analysis Becky and Matt have been talking about. And again, at this point in time, you have a tremendous spread between the interest rates, which are historically low levels, and the investment return. We've had other clients do these type of bonds when the spread is 2 or 2.5 points. And the projection here is that it would be at least a 3.5 point spread Early on, we've had clients do these before, when we've had clients do this in the bond market when the bond rate was 6% or 7% and the interest rate investment returns were 9 or 10%. Goes to some of the issues that Josh talked about of whether plans were well thought out or not based on the structure. And again, as Bucky alluded to, you have a very conservative structure here. Documentation that the pension obligation bond has been authorized in our bond council opinion, which we would give in that regard. Documentation that the city has adopted an ordinance approving this, which clearly has to happen. And also that ordinance needs to require on a going forward basis, the state legislation requires that you're going to make the actuarial determined contribution. What the state's trying to ensure, you're of course going to make your debt service payments, because once you issue the bonds, you have a contract with the bondholders to pay them. The state also wants to make sure that the other portion of the payment that Becky talked about, you're going to also continue to make. The state wants to ensure that some municipalities have thought they could just issue the pension obligation bonds and quit making the normal cost, as Becky told you, to fund the current liabilities on the plan. So the legislation is designed to make sure that you're going to continue to fund that. Identify the method and the actuarial assumptions to make sure the plan is realistic. If we were going to go into the state now with an investment return of 7.25% or 7.5%, which you might have done years ago, they would look at you cross-eyed right now because they would basically say that's not a conservative assumption, that's not the assumption that folks are following on their investment returns based on the historic returns in the market. We will do what we normally do on any bond issue. We'll prepare an official statement of the city that discusses the city's finances, discusses the effect of the pension obligation bonds on the city on a current basis, on a going forward basis, and then we'll go ahead and do what we normally would do to close a bond issue. We also, in the context of this, provide any other information that OPM and the state treasurer would request. And Becky and I have been through this before with a number of clients. It's an iterative process. They will come back, they will ask like questions, they're going to kick the tires. And again, really, I think from the city's point of view, is a protection that they're the experts at the state looking at the issuance of the pension obligation bonds. And I think I'm back to Mark.
Just one question. How would this impact future bonding?
I don't think it really has an effect on your future bonding. It is, remember the debt service on these bonds is, from a budgetary basis, are really designed to replace the contributions you're otherwise making. So if you're asking whether this would affect your ability to bond for other projects in the future, I think the answer is no. The state does calculate your debt through different categories: schools, sewers, pensions. This falls into a totally separate category, which of course you haven't bonded in yet. So I'm considering, I wouldn't consider this as just, even the rating agencies, and maybe Matt can answer this question, don't really consider this the same as bonding for school projects or sewers or roads and that type of thing. It's a different category because it is replacing what would otherwise be monies you'd have to spend on the unfunded liability.
Thank you.
The next slide, which the writing's a little bit small, is going to begin to address what Councilperson Bettencourt asked. How do we make money on this? How do we get to 6.25% or something like that?
That was actually on my list, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to address that now.
Good, thank you.
Two things on this slide that we'll address. One is that we're not going to invest the funds in one shot. It'll be over 18 to 36 months, or a year and a half to 3 years. Because what we don't want to have happen is we don't want to invest the money on March 1st of 2020, and then by the end of the month, we're down 30%. So we want to do this over a year and a half to 3 years in 5 different segments. And those investments will be done based on something called capital markets assumptions. It's something Becky alluded to. It's a diversification of the portfolio. So if you look at this chart, there's 2 different segments. One's equilibrium, one is strategic. And our firm's a bit unique. Equilibrium is what Becky actuaries look at, and most investment firms are called capital markets assumptions, looking out 20 to 30 years. trying to make the best estimates of what the markets are going to return by different asset classes. So if you look at this, it's everything from fixed income to international stock, to growth stocks, to large cap stocks, small cap stocks, private equity. And it has the rate of return and the difference between the best and the worst scenario, which on this chart is called the standard deviation. Okay, and I don't think we have to go through that. So we're with a global firm where we have economists, money managers, all different kinds of CFAs, CPAs, everything, looking at the markets from all different perspectives, geopolitical and economic. So we've come up as equilibrium, which is a 30-year look, and then there's one called strategic. Strategic is a 1 to 3 year look. If you think about the chart I put up before, we look at it as a market cycle. One market cycle is 1 to 3 years. So when we start this out with the 5 different pieces going in over 1.5 to 3 years, in the first year or 2 years, we're not going to hit the 6.25% unless we get very lucky, but we're going to hit probably 4 to 6%. But over time, we will hit the 6.25%. But we always update the strategic, the 1 to 3 year cycle every 1 to 2 years. If interest rates start to move up, that would make this a home run right away. Any questions on that? Or?
Is my microphone working again? Yeah. Okay. So I mentioned earlier that part of the package we've put together here to protect the city, to provide budgetary stability, is a reserve fund mechanism. In the first year, next year, when you issue the bonds, the contribution that you've already budgeted, you'll transfer into a reserve fund. And then you'll use the reserve fund to augment the city's contribution anytime the market drops enough to cause an increase in the pension contribution, in the pension cost of more than 3%. And I've pulled out here just one of those 10,000 scenarios. This is scenario number 2,398. Happens to be a good one for illustrating some ups and downs in the market. So anytime the pension contribution is going up, it's because the market's been going down. So we have a period in this particular scenario, bad market conditions, contribution goes up. Good market conditions, the contribution goes down, and then we repeat again. Towards the end here, it's a particularly great market, so the contribution is dropping a lot. You can see the debt service, the orange, is constant. What's changing is the city's contribution underneath. And then the purple bars are the things that are happening with the reserve fund. In the periods where the contribution would be going up a lot from one year to the next, more than 3%, the reserve fund will kick in and contribute some of the contribution into the pension trust. So remember, it's a reserve fund. It's sitting off to the side. It's not being invested in the market. It's being invested in conservative funds like other reserve funds that the city has. And if the year-over-year contribution goes up by more than 3%, the city's budget will take the first 3%. But the reserve fund will kick in to pay the rest of the pension contribution for that year. So in this particular scenario, there are actually these 4 years in a row, a little bit of a fifth year here, where the translation of scenario 2398 in the late 30s, don't quote me, is that the market is going to hell in a handbasket, right? So this is going to hell in a handbasket. The pension contribution's rising rapidly, but the reserve fund is going to kick in and help the city's budget handle what would otherwise be significant increases in the city's contribution. That's protection. That's helping protect the city, protect you against volatility in the budgeted pension contributions. In the good times on this is the same scenario, but there's some good times when the pension contribution is falling. And in those good times, when the city's contribution would have gone down from one year to the next because the markets were strong, you're going to take those savings and shore up the reserve fund, replenish the reserve fund. And if the reserve fund is fine, you're going to shore up the pension trust. And if the reserve fund and the pension trust are fine, you're going to shore up the OPEB trust. And only if all three are fine is the city going to take a reduction in the pension contribution. So it's a replenishment mechanism so that in good times, some money flows back into the reserve fund so that when there are bad times, there's money in the reserve fund to help protect the city. So in this particular scenario, there was replenishment here and here, these open purple bars, and there was usage in these years here. And one of the things we tracked across all the 10,000 scenarios is what happened to the reserve fund. And there are, among that 10,000, there are scenarios where the reserve fund never gets touched. At the end of the bond repayment period, if there's money left in the reserve fund, it comes back to the city. City can spend it for anything. There are also scenarios in here where the reserve fund gets completely depleted. So it's done its job. It was a god-awful 25 years. The reserve fund got fully depleted, but while it was there, it served its purpose and helped protect the city against budget volatility. So this is a protective mechanism. You're giving up a little bit of potential investment income because you're taking money that you otherwise would have put into the pension trust where it could earn better returns, and you're putting it off in a cash account. So you're giving up a little bit of your savings, but what you're getting is more budgetary stability. So it's a protective mechanism. It's a hedge to help protect the city's budget from too much volatility. Any questions about the reserve fund mechanism? Sure.
Who would decide who would make the determination about how much we need to start off with in that reserve fund?
So all of the details about the reserve fund will be written into an ordinance. So it'll be set in ordinance that you'll follow for the next 25 years. That an initial payment is equal to the contribution that you've otherwise budgeted for fiscal 2022. And I'm going from memory, but I want to say it's $13.7 million. So your reserve fund at the beginning will have $13.7 million in it. It'll be invested in a very safe cash-like investment, STIF funds most likely, or something like that. So you won't earn a lot of investment income.
Thank you.
Okay, so when I first ran as treasurer, I promised the taxpayers that I would always keep them in mind and do the best thing that I possibly could. So last March, when I saw the rate on our money market plummet overnight, I said, well, we're not going to make much, but maybe we can save some. And I started bugging Josh about pension obligation bonds, so here we are. So please, again, make no mistake, we currently owe $145 million to our pensioners. Okay, that debt exists now. So that debt or liability, we want to flip to this type of liability. And we want to fix the payments over a 25-year period to give the council certainty when they go to create their budgets. And our analysis today, presented here, assumes that the bonds are issued at a 3% interest rate now. You heard earlier that West Hartford issued their bonds, I believe it was yesterday, at 2.5-ish. Not to say that we would, but we're assuming 3%. The pension reserve fund is established with what the city would have paid into the pension trust to cover the actuarial determined contribution in fiscal year 2022, which Becky just talked about. Okay, that is already budgeted. That's in the budget. The pension reserve fund is used if the actuarial determined contribution plus the debt service goes up by more than 3% from one year to the next. The pension reserve fund or pension or OPEB, other post-employee benefit trust, is replenished if the actuarial determined contribution goes down. The actuarial determined contribution is based on lowering interest rates assumptions to 6.25%, a conservative approach, in funding any future unfunded liability over the same period as the bond repayments. Thank you. John?
Okay, well, you know that I'm up again, so it's just about over, right? So I wanted to go quickly through the approval process and the next steps that we need to go through. So in July, the Norwich Personnel and Pension Board will take a look at this and hopefully support the plan, approve the changes in the actuarial assumptions, and appropriation of POB professional service costs, because we're doing this analysis and it does cost us money to pay some of the experts to do this. Then also in July, NPU commissioners and the Board of Education will hopefully support the plan, review and consider the POB repayment plan. Then in August, the City Council will consider approval of the POB ordinance. And remember, that's because it's a bonding ordinance, that's a 2/3 vote rather than a majority vote. You would approve the referendum question.
John, I think it's 5 votes.
5, I'm sorry, 5.
2/3 would be 6.
Right. A POB repayment plan and an ordinance amending the pension funding creation of the pension plan. Remember, we've got to get it done by August, as I said in the beginning, because the referendum is going to be on the general ballot in November. The Secretary of State has to review it, and they get a few months to do that. They need till September. So assuming that all that gets done, we have the bond referendum, which would be held election day of November. The state of Connecticut doesn't want to waste their time reviewing it if it's not going to pass. So they wait until after it passes to do their review. So hopefully in December, they review it and give it a stamp of approval. And then finally, we would issue bonds in February of 2022. Now, one more caveat on this. If interest rates between now and when we went to market in February went up quite a bit, then we would put the brakes on this. We wouldn't do it. What that number is I'm not sure exactly. I don't know if the experts know at what point we put the brakes on. But if the interest rate environment was going up and our issuance of the bonds was going to be a higher percentage than 3, then we'd have to take a look at it. That's always possible. We have 8 months between now and February, so anything is possible at that point. We don't think that's going to happen. The market looks pretty stable, but you never know. So that would be the process, and then everything else would then kick in. The proceeds would be part of the reserve fund, and we would go forward. One other thing, the portion of your pension plan that is part of your budget, like NPU has a certain portion of the 13.2 million I don't know offhand what it is, but let's say it's 4 million or something like that. When the savings come around, they're going to see the 4 million hopefully go down or stay stable. And so on with the Board of Education, be the same thing. Whatever their percentage of the 13.7 million payment is, they will have that portion allocated. And that's the way it's done now. Everybody pays their share. It adds up to 13.7. The city, their share, and so on. One other question, I don't know if we have any, I invited them very late, but I invited union presidents, and we would hope that we'll have a separate meeting at some point with the union presidents. Certainly, it's in the best interest of union presidents to have a nice solvent fund, a pension fund. And we think that this is a way to strengthen it and potentially save the city money, which will be good for the employees and obviously good for the citizens. So with that, unless there's anything else, we can conclude this in 1 hour and 10 minutes, which was good. If there's any questions, we can get together after. We do have some cold drinks and some snacks in we're in 335. Where is that? Where they are? I don't even know. Huh?
Yeah, that's where they're supposed to be.
Okay, so please join us for a Diet Coke soft drink or whatever, and you can talk with some of the experts one-on-one if you desire. So thank you all for coming, and I know it was a hot day and everything, and this gets a little dry, but I hope it was as interesting as I think it is. Thank you.